Today we're going to talk about diet analysis in Zoo Diet Navigator. We're going to divide this into two parts. One is the diet analysis data, so the feed analysis, and getting that into Navigator. And the second part is analyzing a diet. So to start out with the feed analysis, we're going to go to Settings and Edit Foods. And you'll see here that we have the nutrient analysis of this food in this Add and Edit Foods screen. So you can pick any food. We can go to, let's go to, and you can just start typing. We're going to go to hay, Timothy hay. And you can see that we have many analysis on this hay over time. You can import this directly from DairyOne, and I'll show you how to do that. Or you can manually type these in each time. For each analysis, please note that this is on an as-fed basis. You'll pick a nutrient, the unit, the amount. These are percentages, but they're whole numbers. It's not 0.9, it's 90%. The date, the source, the sample ID, any sort of descriptive information you want about it. And you can enter a quality index. So this is where you can choose whether this is the analytical data you got from a lab, whether you calculated it. So some items are calculated by difference. So, this is from analytical values, but it's calculated from NIR data, from the literature. Sometimes we just assume something is zero. If you want to, do the NDF or ADF content of water, for example, like you can just assume that there's no fiber in water and put zero, even though you're not ever going to send a sample of water to a lab to analyze it for fiber. The demo data that you downloaded will be marked as demo data. And in general, this is not reliable data. It's old, it's out of date. It may have been messed with over the years. I don't really know. I would not rely on using the demo data for any sort of analyses that you're considering critical for the health of an animal. And then null would just be, not included. You're not putting a quality index on it, or you can leave it blank. So for any of these, you can put that in. So this is a way that you can also kind of keep track of your samples, and you can look at how dry matter is probably not as interesting, but you can look at how the protein content of your hay has changed over time. You can see that we had a hay sample recently that was 11% protein, but mostly it's 4 or 6. So you can get an idea of the variance in your feeds as well. Once you have your nutrient data, then you can put that into diets. But the other thing is you might not always put it into diets in units of grams. So for example, for hay, we have 2 custom units set up. We have one flake is, for our hay, your hay may be different, is 1,700 grams. One bale is 28,000 grams. And so this way you can feed out in units of bales or flakes if that makes more sense for your operation. Pretty much you can use any unit. You just have to define it here for each food in the custom units. If you do not define a custom unit and you use it in a diet, nothing terrible will happen, but you'll get this alert when you go to log in that 2 custom units need attention, and you can go to the settings to fix that. So under settings, you can come here and you can define your custom units, and you'll get this little pop-up. This is an example I did just for this. I made a tablespoon of hay, which obviously is ridiculous, but that's just an example of if you used a new combination of food and custom unit, you can define that. So units of weight are always okay. So grams, kilograms, pounds, ounces, those always work. But if you put in a custom unit, then you need to define it for each food. If you want to import from the DairyOne laboratory, you can come back here to settings, and there's an import data from DairyOne. If you click here, it'll walk you through the process. You open up the converter, you load your file, you match up the samples that you sent with the actual food names, and then you import it. Okay, so let's say you're happy with the data that you have in there and you want to analyze a diet. You're going to come back to Welcome Switchboard, go to Edit Diet Plans, and you'll see that you have options. So Analyze Diet is the button, and this will, by default, analyze the diet for diet number 3. So I'm going to click this. And this is our dummy diet that we have at the beginning. There it goes. So I specifically highlighted 2 things on here. You'll notice that there's a lot of errors on this sheet. And that's because 2 foods are problematic. You'll see they have an asterisk and they also have a define. So this is where I didn't define a tablespoon for Timothy Hay, and so it's going to not come through. And this is where I also played with a custom unit called a bucket for Omeline. And so this is where it doesn't work. You're going to have to go back and fix your diet. So I'm going to close this, don't save. And I'm going to come back here, and in Timothy Hay, I'm going to put this in units of grams. I'm going to put this into grams. I'm going to save this diet, and I'm going to say converted units to grams. Some sort of reason there. Oh, I have it set up that whenever we save a diet, it saves a PDF of this diet to a folder that all of our keepers can access. So that's what that was doing. By default, I have that turned off just because it adds this extra amount of seconds. But I'm going to go click this Analyze Diet button again now that I've cleaned up the problems on this diet. Sometimes the Excel document opens up behind Access, and so you can see it blinking down in your toolbar and you have to bring it to the front. In this case, it just took a minute. So now you can see that none of the foods are red. This means that all of the foods are in units that Navigator can understand. They've all been able to be converted to grams, and there's nutrient data for each of those foods. So if you see any red, that means you need to clean up that sort of data. What is here has been converted to average daily grams. So what that means is, let's say that you have 14 grams of apple on Monday, only on Mondays. It's going to take that 14 grams of apple divided by 7 days in a week and say that there's an average of 2 grams of apple per day. If that apple is only fed every second week, so every other Monday, then it's going to take the 14 grams of apple divided by a 14-week time span and say that there's an average daily grams of 1 gram of apple per day. So this takes all of your rotations and all of your schedules and makes an average daily grams. So looking across, you've got the energy that is coming from protein, fat, and carbohydrate by difference, and the total gross energy. So this is the total amount of energy in a food. Of course, not all of that is always available to the animal, depending on the food and their digestive system. And that's where you have to understand a little bit about animal physiology to understand how much of that is typically going to be available to your species. But you can see that in this diet, 78% of our calories are coming from carbohydrates, 7% are from fat, and 15% are from protein. Moving down here, this is the total number of grams, or as you get down into some other things, milligrams, of those nutrients. And this is the proportion. So 208 grams out of 1,000 some odd dry matter grams works out to be 17.6% protein. So this is the grams, and then this is the proportion. You'll notice that some things are grayed out. This is an important distinction for me that I don't have the data. If I care about taurine for this species, I do not have any taurine data. You can see that there's no data here. And I've only got a little bit of the methionine data. So it'll tell you a number because I have some of the data. So you know that there's at least 0.45 grams. But it's grayed out because you shouldn't rely on this data. If you care about it, you should go back to Navigator. You should send some feed samples out to a lab for analysis and fill in the blanks for the foods that you care about. Same thing here. We have a crude fat value, but we don't have these omega-3s and 6s. We have a little bit of data, but not enough. So you come down here and you'll see that some of them are red. That basically just means that they are less than the minimum requirement. So this minimum requirement comes from the requirements here. It defaults to primate, but you can pick anything else. So this is a fish. Let's consider maybe it's like a growing tilapia. I don't know. And now you can see that for a growing tilapia, these nutrients are okay, but it's protein deficient compared to, oh, sorry, did I pick salmon? Compared to either salmon or tilapia. This diet is not sufficient. And of course, this is a completely made up diet that it's not necessarily for this species. But it'll highlight anything that is too low in red. Currently, nothing gets highlighted if it's too high. We don't have upper limits for most nutrients, but that is definitely something we would like to develop. If anybody is interested in helping with that or has data that you think would contribute to that project, please let me know. Over to the right is just sort of a proportional breakdown of the major proximate analysis or major macronutrients. And you can see that this diet is very high in fiber, ash, protein, fat. Down here, you have a triangle. This is based on a survey of zoo diets at one large institution. It does not mean that this is any sort of recommendation, just that this is where at least one institution kept their diets. And so if you think this is a carnivorous fish, you could compare this to carnivores and you could see that you are way off from where carnivores are. But maybe we perhaps are using the wrong one, and this is actually a grazing animal, in which case you'd be spot on in terms of the section of this. So this would be a high carbohydrate, low fat, low protein corner, which is where we'd find most grazers. And that's where this diet is finding itself. Again, this is a completely made up diet, but it's mostly hay and fruit based, it looks like, with a very starchy pellet. So that makes sense that it's a high carbohydrate diet. So the location in here is sort of where it fits on this carbohydrate fat protein continuum. And you can click all these other areas to see where they might fall. The color is actually sort of indicative of how much non-structural carbohydrate, so non-fiber carbohydrate would be starches and sugars mostly, versus fiber there are. So a grazer would be heavily skewed towards the fibrous side of carbohydrates. And then as you get closer to frugivore, you would be down to only a little bit of fibrous carbohydrates. So that's why this is sort of looking like a frugivorous animal. So this is orange, indicating that it's got greater than 50% non-structural carbohydrate, sugars and starches. And that's primarily because of the large amount of apples and the large amount of crane diet that's on here. So this may or may not be of use to you. So the idea of this sheet in particular is that you could sit down with a keeper, and the keeper comes to you and wants to add blueberries to this diet. And we'll do fresh blueberries. You'll see I typed a word and everything went crazy. As soon as you type a number, even if that number is 0, it all goes back. So the keeper wants to know, like, what's the impact of feeding maybe 500 grams a day of fresh blueberries? So we're going to look at things like energy. Let's look and see what it does to energy to add 500 grams a day of blueberries. It goes up a little bit. Is that significant or not depends on you and your knowledge of the animal. Are you trying to get it to maintain weight, gain weight, lose weight? What are you working on here? We can go back and forth. It reduced the level of protein in the diet. And if we are trying to get it to match this fish, then maybe that's not the direction we want to go. Let's look at sugars. So water-soluble carbohydrates, 18%. And if I go back to 0, it's only 13%. So we've gone from 13% of the diet being sugar to 18% of the diet being sugar. Obviously, this is a made-up animal and a made-up diet, but if we're concerned about its dental health or something, maybe this is too high. Maybe this animal really isn't a frugivore, and you shouldn't be feeding it like one. This is where your knowledge of the animal and the species and sort of a understanding of what the changes mean will be very helpful. So you can look at starch, neutral detergent fiber, acid detergent fiber, and you can look at, so does adding 500 grams of blueberry change NDF? Goes from 38 to 36. Maybe not a huge difference. So if fiber was the thing that you were concerned about, adding blueberries may have no impact on the fiber, minimal impact on the fiber, and you can probably continue feeding that. But this is a way that you can have a live conversation with somebody where they can see the impact. They can see that adding the food they want to feed doubles the sugar or halves the sugar or takes out the fiber. So the idea behind this is to really spark that conversation with your animal people in person while they're sitting side by side with you looking at the same screen. This is to sort of get away from those conversations where somebody just asks for something and you don't know what they're trying to do with it. And you're not having that point where they understanding the implications of that change. So this is giving you that moment to really sit and consider the whole diet together with that person. So that's the first tab. The second tab is energy calculation. And the only place you should be entering any numbers into here are these yellow squares. So on the diet analysis, you can enter foods if they want to ask about adding avocado, banana. Again, remember you have to have a number. So you just have to type a number. The number can even be 0. But you can enter information up here. You can enter information here. And the energy calcs, this is where you would enter information. So basically just the yellow squares are the only spaces for you to type into. Here's a list of a bunch of different energy calculations for ME, or metabolizable energy. So this is how much energy basically the animal is spending to exist each day. So in general, these are something like field metabolic rates or measured metabolic rates of animals in zoological conditions. So this is not resting metabolic rate. This is sort of a pretty good target of what we think they need to be able to get out of their diet. So I think we were using a fish. We don't actually have a fish energy requirement here. They tend to come from the high production operations and so aren't particularly applicable to the zoological setting. But let's just pretend for a second that we're going to use the canine recommendations. So maybe 1,400 calories would be needed for a 25 kilo animal. Let's just say it's a 1 kilo animal. So it needs 130 calories. We come over here, we're feeding it 5,000 calories. Even the least digestible diet in the world, that's still probably overkill. So this probably indicates that we're feeding too much, and we could reduce all of this by some fraction. But you can look and see if it was a large breed or if it was inactive. Maybe this is an inactive animal, so you might only want 95 calories. But again, you have to understand that if an animal needs 95 calories, you probably need to feed it more than 95 calories so that it has enough energy. Because this is the food energy and this is the animal spending energy. And of course, some of the food energy goes into feces or heat or other things that are not directly going to support the animal. The nutrient grams tab shows you exactly how many grams are coming from each food. So not all summed up, but individually. And this is where you can also start to see that we have 0% of the data for this column. We have 100% of the data for that column. We have, 12% of the data for some of these columns. So you can start to assess which things you want to fill in. If you don't care about cellulose, you don't need to fill in cellulose. This is the exact same as the next tab, except this one is a proportion and this one is grams. So this is just the raw grams, and this is the proportion. So 44% of the dry matter in this diet is coming from alfalfa hay. And then this table is where all of your data got exported from Navigator. So if you chose average, this will be the average. If you chose the most recent, this will be the most recent data for each thing. And any of the foods that are currently on the diet will be in yellow. That makes it easy to quickly scroll to them. So that's the data that's going to be used behind these calculations.